All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tuleyome's April Nature and You lecture. I am Jeff Ben. I'm the Education Associate at Tuleyome. If you don't know, Tuleyome is a conservation nonprofit based in Woodland, California. Our mission is to engage in active stewardship and advocacy with diverse communities to conserve, enhance, restore, and enjoy the lands in our region. The region that we focus on is the Northern Inner Coast Range, with a particular focus on the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument. If you don't know, the Northern Inner Coast Range are the mountains that are located to the west of Sacramento, Davis, and Woodland. And the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument is the relatively new national monument that runs for about 300 miles from near the southern end of Lake Berryessa up through the Cache Creek Wilderness, all the way on up to the Snow Mountain Wilderness. Tuleyome does a variety of different things. So we do education programs for K-12 students. I'll be taking 50 second graders out tomorrow morning. We also do California Certified Naturalist courses. We do a variety of hikes and trail building days that are open to the general public, as well as wildflower tours. We have one of those coming up next week. If you are interested in that, check out our events page. We're also involved in advocacy. We played a key role in the establishment of the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument, and we're a leader in the coalition that is working to expand the national monument by adding Moloch Loyak, which is a ecologically and culturally significant ridgeline that's right on the border of the current national monument. And so, without any further ado, I will introduce our speaker for tonight. So, we are very lucky to have Sarah Killingsworth from Project Coyote. And so Sarah is the Keeping It Wild Youth Education and Outreach Program Coordinator for Project Coyote. And she is also an attorney, certified California naturalist, wildlife photographer, and filmmaker. And so really looking forward to your talk, Sarah. And so during the talk, if you have any questions, let's hang on to those, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. All right, Sarah, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone who's attending. I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So as Jeff mentioned, I'm with Project Coyote. I'm the Keeping It Wild program chair. I do youth education and outreach, as well as other public speaking and education around coexistence with coyotes. And I'm really excited to share some fun facts about coyotes and some coexistence tips with all of you tonight. Anytime I talk about wildlife, I encourage the audience to think about a couple of things as I show images and share information. And the first question for you is, what do you notice in the animals in the images? So to think about what aspects of them you take in as you look at the photos. And then the second question is, what do you wonder? What questions arise as we talk about the animals and as you look at images of their behavior? As Jeff mentioned, the questions for me, I'm super happy to take questions. I love dialogue and talking about wildlife. So there will be plenty of time at the end, and Jeff will help moderate questions that might get entered into the chat or the question function, or just the old-fashioned raising the hand one way or the other digitally. A last note that as a wildlife photographer, all of the images in this presentation were taken by me, but I take them with a very long lens. And so even though the images make the animal appear as if it is close to me, it is much further away than it might seem in the picture. And with that, go to the next slide. So a quick intro to who I am and why I do this work. This is my why. This is a bobcat kitten, roughly 2 months old. And I have been very fortunate to spend time not just with coyotes, but with a variety of other native predators. My heart really belongs to the bobcats, although coyotes and foxes have a significant part of that, as well as badgers. And my initial conservation storytelling work was in suburban bobcats and how bobcats learned to live in urban and suburban environments and raise kittens. And so my way of giving back to the animals that I've been lucky enough to spend some time with is to do education and provide a voice since they are unable to speak for themselves. So a couple other bobcat images. The one on the left, these are both adults. The one on the left has a gopher in its mouth, and like coyotes, bobcats provide excellent rodent control. So native predators are excellent for rodent control. And then this is the species we're here tonight to talk about. These are coyotes. On the left is two young coyote pups. I was fortunate to be able to photograph, again, from a far distance with a very long lens and a cropped image, but young coyotes on a den. And then on the right is a coyote engaged in a hunt. This is a hunt for voles, like a field mouse that's on the surface as opposed to gophers. They have different techniques for different prey, but it's a fun hop, skip, jump to watch when they do that. So a couple of questions for you as we start. When we talk about our wild neighbors and we talk about coyotes, one question I have is what behavior or traits come to mind when you think about a coyote? So lots of preconceptions about coyotes exist in our society, and you could think of Wile E. Coyote, you could think of a trickster. You could think of something that is very smart or adaptable or perhaps scary. There's lots of things that come up. So just think about what arises in your own mind when I say the word coyote. And then, as I mentioned, I would love for you as I go through the talk to just think about what you notice in the pictures about the animals. And then the last thing, and I don't know if people can raise their digital hand if your screens are blacked out, but if you've seen coyotes in your neighborhood, you can raise your hand. I suspect that is most of us. But they are here and they are in pretty much all the urban and suburban environments one would think, especially in California. We've got them in San Francisco and a lot of other big cities, Chicago, all across the country. So they are definitely our neighbors. So the Latin name for coyote is Canis latrans, which is barking dog. And this is a juvenile, not yet a year old, hunting at sunset. This is an adult coyote in a little bit more of a winter coat, so a little bit of a fluffier coat, but just looking at this animal, you might notice it has large ears, it has a pointed nose, it has long legs, fluffy tail, things like that. Some fast facts about coyotes, because again, people have a lot of preconceptions about them. Coyotes are usually 20 to 45 pounds, and on the West Coast, they're probably more like 20 to 35 pounds. The East Coast variety are a little bit bigger and heavier. Sometimes people think coyotes are as large as like a German Shepherd, and the reality is a German Shepherd is 2 to 3 times the size of a coyote in terms of weight. Males are slightly larger and slightly heavier than females. They do mate for life, so if you see a pair, the larger one will be the male. They're normally 3.5 to 4.5 feet in length, but that includes the tail. And standing at the shoulder, they're about 2 feet tall. Most coyotes have a black tip on their tail, but some have a white tip, and they usually have brown eyes, but there is a rare variation. Some of you may have seen Nat Geo did a story on it called them 1 in a million. There are blue-eyed coyotes in California. We have them in Point Reyes National Seashore, which is close to where I am right now and where I do a lot of my photography, but they're also in some other parts of California and the Southwest. Here's another blue-eyed coyote image. You can really see how the eyes are a light blue instead of a sort of caramel brown. Coyotes hunt using a combination of their senses, but they frequently use their sense of smell to find food. And so you'll see them running along with their nose on the ground. They're really great jumpers. They can jump vertically 6 to 8 feet from a stand. They also have excellent hearing. I mentioned earlier those large ears, and you'll see if you watch one hunting, particularly hunting gophers, something underground, they tilt their head from side to side to get a good angle for those ears to really hear what's happening underground beneath them. They are a very prominent character in a lot of Native American folklore, often as the trickster, but coyote is truly a Native American animal, and it was really a revered one. The Latin name, as I mentioned, means barking dog. But what I think is really fascinating is the word coyote is actually a Spanish adaptation of a Nahuatl name, which was coyotl. So there are very few words that we use in English that are derived from a Native American term, and coyote is one. This is a coyote with a winter coat, so you can see how much thicker and fluffier it is, which I think is part of why sometimes people think they're larger and heavier than they are. The winter coats can be quite thick. So survival. For wildlife, every day is about survival. That's their only goal. And so what do coyotes need to survive? It's actually a lot like what we all need to survive. They need healthy food sources, they need clean water, they need a place to sleep, and need a place to raise their young. And while they are very adaptable and very intelligent, living amongst us in suburban and urban areas carries an increased risk for them, and particularly risks of being hit by cars and consuming rodents that have already been poisoned. So when we put out, if you use a rodenticide and you poison the gophers or the rats or other things in your area, and that rodent doesn't die immediately, it wanders off, and a coyote eats it, the coyote, along with many other species that eat these rodents, can get secondary poisoning. When coyotes raise pups, they will use a den. And so coyotes don't use dens just for sleeping in, they'll sleep above ground. The den is really for raising pups. And they can use a tree stump, they can use a rocky outcropping. Sometimes they'll use a burrow made by another animal. A lot of the coyote dens that I see and photograph are actually badger digs that the coyotes will get in and adapt and make a little, they'll dig them out a little bit more, make them a little bit bigger for their pups. Sometimes the coyotes will dig their own hole from scratch, but often they'll try and find something in the landscape they can adapt. Denning season, which is right now, is generally April through August. It varies a little bit year to year based on weather and temperature, precipitation, things like that. But they'll have pups in a den. And during denning season, as any parent is protective, coyotes are protective of their pups and of that den location. And so one of the things that happens is coyotes sometimes engage in a behavior that people find disconcerting because they accompany you as you walk by. They'll sort of follow along, and we call it escorting. But often people feel like they're being stalked and they're worried that it's going to be aggressive. It's actually not an aggressive behavior. It's an assurance. The coyote is walking with you to make sure that you're going to keep going and that you're not going to stop and bother their pups. And so it's important if you're walking dogs and you're in an area that has coyotes during this season in particular, it's really important to keep your dog on a leash, because if the dog smells the pups and gets curious about the den, and dogs have instincts too, then it could easily end up in a situation where it's in danger because the coyote will defend the den and the pups, and the dog might put itself in harm's way. So if you're in an area with coyotes during denning season, it's really best to keep your dog on a leash. So this is another coyote pup. This one's a little bit older, probably 3 to 4 months old. Excuse me. It has, if you notice, it has really big ears and really big paws, and it's like the rest of the coyote needs to grow into those features. Not that different from the dogs we all know and love. So food sources, what do coyotes eat? They are primarily carnivores. So they will generally prefer to eat rodents and rabbits. So there's this misconception that coyotes want to eat, whether it's domestic cats or small dogs, and that they're going to come and look for those. And the truth is that even in urban environments, that's not their preferred food source. A Chicago study, and there are a lot of coyotes in Chicago, found that human associated food like garbage was just 2% of the diet, and domestic cat was just 1%. So even in an urban environment where you have rodents they can eat, they're going to go for those types of food sources first. There's currently a study going on of the coyotes in San Francisco and what their diet consists of. And from the preliminary reports that I've seen, there does seem to be more human garbage in their diet here in San Francisco. They're getting access to more garbage and human food, but still the pets is a very, very small percentage. It's not the preferred food source, even in an urban place. Because gophers live underground, a lot of people have never seen a gopher, so I always include a picture of a gopher. This is a gopher, and they come out, they live in a little hole that's, about 2 inches in diameter. They will pop their head out of the hole, sometimes grab a little bit of vegetation nearby and drag it in. And animals like coyotes and bobcats will wait for that opportunity when the head pops up to try and nab it. So this is a gopher, food source for many animals. When coyotes hunt, so sometimes people think about coyotes and the fact that they live in packs and think about them as hunting in packs or pursuing prey in packs. And unlike wolves, coyotes generally do not engage in hunting, but in anything other than a solitary sole coyote. Occasionally, I've seen two coyotes sort of corralling quail, but generally they hunt individually. And when you're hunting something like a gopher, that makes sense. If wolves are trying to take down an elk or a bison, they might need 11 or 12 of them to get that job done. But hunting a gopher is really a one coyote job. And when they do that, they do a vertical leap and then the nose dive. So what happens is literally their nose hits the hole before with all four paws off the ground. And their goal with that tip of their nose is to grab the head of the gopher and pull it out as they land. This is a gray fox. It's not a coyote, but it illustrates a different point, which is secured trash or unsecured trash is a piece of the coexistence puzzle because it attracts wildlife. And it can attract wildlife a couple different ways. Animals like foxes and coyotes will eat garbage if it's just available to them, but they will also eat the rodents that come to eat the garbage. And so it's sort of a double attraction for animals like foxes and coyotes. As I mentioned, coyotes do live in packs, but they tend to live in relatively small packs. So again, wolves will live in a larger pack, and that's a function in part of the size of the prey that they typically need to take down. Coyotes are generally one pair, sort of what would be considered the alpha pair, or we would say the mating pair. So that's the pair that's going to have offspring. And then typically it is some of their young, their pups from a prior year that have not yet dispersed. And so it's typically 4, 5, maybe 6 coyotes in any group. And eventually, as they get older, they disperse. And not all of the pups survive every year, of course. So they might have more pups than that, but they might not all make it to adulthood. I don't know how many of you have heard coyotes howling. Probably a lot of you if you have them in your neighborhood. One of my favorite sounds when I'm out doing photography late in the day is to have a chorus of coyotes nearby. But coyotes have a remarkable ability to vocalize, and their howling is a way of communicating. And typically, at the end of the day, they're communicating to each other in their pack where they are, and they're coming back together after a time where they've been hunting individually. So they'll come back together as a group at the end of the day. Howling is also a way that they can signal to other coyotes that they're there, that they have a territory and this is their territory. In the summertime, especially if you listen to the howls, you'll hear little yips, and the yips are the pups, and they're learning how to howl, but they have some other vocalizations that they include as well, which can be pretty fun. They sound very excited, usually, very high pitched. Other sounds coyotes can make include barking and huffing and growling. So there are barking can be a warning. It can be a warning to other members of their pack that there's danger. It can be a warning to an intruder like, hey, back off. And then huffing and growling is more in if there's an aggressive encounter, which sometimes there are sort of territorial disputes between two coyotes, and they will vocalize as well as part of that. They also, from a visual standpoint, they communicate not just by sound, but by body language and facial expressions. So it's sort of, if you know dogs can take a submissive posture and you know what that looks like, coyotes similarly will take a submissive posture sometimes. They also, when they're aggressive, will sort of snarl back their upper lip. And that's saying that the hair on the back of your neck stands up. That's an actual thing with wild dogs in particular. And so if you see a coyote or a wolf engaged in a conflict, you will see literally the hair on the back of their neck stand up. Coyotes are also one of the most misunderstood and persecuted wild animals we have in North America. Unfortunately, 500,000 are killed every year, and there's a variety of consequences of killing coyotes. One is that coyotes are killed sometimes as an attempt to manage their populations out of a concern for either ranching or agricultural interests. And the problem with killing coyotes is they have a special adaptation, which when their population is under pressure, the females actually end up creating larger litters of pups. It's a very unusual, unique feature. So if a coyote might normally have 7 pups, if members of that pack have been killed and they're under pressure, she might have 11 pups instead. And so it actually can serve to increase the number of coyotes in the area. It also, in a pack structure, there's one mating pair that's having offspring. But if one of those two is killed, sometimes that pack will split into 2 packs and create 2 mating pairs, and then both of them are having pups. And so again, you're getting larger numbers of pups coming out of trying to kill some of the existing coyotes. It also can serve to increase the conflict with humans, because sometimes the older coyotes, the ones that know better sort of how to hunt and how to manage being around humans, are the ones killed, and you are left with juveniles who may not have as much of an understanding of how to find food. There are roughly 2.5 million coyotes in the country, and they are remarkably widespread after initially being primarily in the southwest of the United States. During the westward expansion, as Western Europeans moved from the East Coast to the West Coast, there was a general persecution and slaughter of native predators. And so animals like mountain lions, grizzly bears, and wolves were eradicated in many places. And that left an opening in those ecosystems that coyotes, being smart and adaptable, had no problem filling. And so they have, despite being killed in record numbers and ongoing sort of nationwide persecution, as well as things like wildlife killing contests, they continue to thrive and sort of defy efforts to reduce their population. So there are lots of things we can do to help coyotes and other native predators because they are our neighbors, and we all benefit from getting along and living side by side without conflict. The most important thing, the one thing I would love everyone to take away from this talk and any talk I do, is please never feed wildlife. I mean, putting aside your backyard bird feeder, please don't feed wildlife. Even if it's an animal you think is suffering, is starving, is in need, the best thing you can do is call your local wildlife rehabilitation center or the Humane Society. But feeding wildlife creates a cycle which ultimately often leads to conflict because animals that lose their fear of humans. So the starting premise for all wildlife is they're afraid of us, and they should be. As the most dangerous species on this planet, humans should be scary to all wild animals. They shouldn't want to approach us. But if an animal, especially an animal that starts out getting fed when it's young, if an animal is fed by humans and starts to associate people with food, then they become comfortable approaching other humans. And some of the new humans that they start approaching might not feed them. And that can lead to aggressive behavior because they might not know how to feed themselves. They might not have learned to hunt if they were depending on food from people. And so if there's then a conflict and that animal nips at a person, they generally will want to test the animal for rabies. And the way to do that is to euthanize it and test its brain. So we have a saying, a fed coyote is a dead coyote, because ultimately the act of feeding it creates this trajectory where the likely outcome is there will be conflict. And if anybody's ever nipped in that conflict, that animal will be killed. It's also risky. So this photo is a relatively well-known coyote named Limpy. It's actually in Yellowstone, um, probably injured being hit by a car. But Limpy has obviously been fed and approaches cars on the road. And this is one of the main roads in Yellowstone. And in this image, the driver of the car was actually a photographer, and the coyote had been off the road, and then the photographer pulled over, opened the door, intending, I think, to take a picture. But the coyote saw the car door open and went running across the road to the car, hoping it was going to get fed. So, another consequence of wildlife being fed near roads is that it increases the risk of road strikes and death that way. So, other things we can do to help coyotes are to keep your cats inside, to keep your dogs on a leash when you're walking them, especially in parks and places where there are coyotes, and super especially during denning season. Keeping pet food and water inside is another one. There's conscious and intentional feeding of wildlife. As I mentioned, somebody handing, a hot dog or a piece of chicken to an animal is intentionally feeding them. But we also have unintentional feeding, and unintentional feeding is usually either unsecured trash that then provides food waste that animals can easily get into, or the other common way is with pet food and water, because that looks like a buffet to a lot of animals, raccoons, coyotes, foxes, even bobcats. You could end up with a mix of species in the yard, which can create conflict amongst those animals as well as conflict with your pet. So keeping pet food inside is another important piece. And the trash containers, as I mentioned, keeping those, with a bungee cord or latch so that they can't get knocked over and spilled on the road is important. And then rodenticides are something I mentioned earlier as well. The best way to deal with rodents is to have a native predator or to have owls or other things. Raptors are the solution, has a lot of great information about this issue. But rodenticides cause an enormous amount of harm, not just poisoning the target rodents, but also a variety of species from owls to hawks to bobcats and coyotes. So best to not use rodenticides. And then coyotes are also near the roads for hunting. So coyotes at dusk and dawn in particular will hunt, although they do hunt during the day, and especially when animals are feeding their young, they're much more likely to have to hunt, excuse me, more hours of the day. So if you think about, if you're hunting to feed yourself, you only have to catch X number of gophers. Let's say it's 4 in a day. But now you're feeding 7 pups and yourself, you're going to have to come up with a lot more gophers. And so the amount of hunting time, especially in the summer for most native predators, gets expanded. And so people are sometimes concerned when they see things like bobcats or coyotes out during the day hunting. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them. It probably means that they just need to get more food because they're feeding their young as well as themselves. But roads provide a drainage area. So when you are driving on a road, either side of the road has the drainage, and that is generally going to have a lot of moisture and a lot of vegetation, and therefore a lot of things like gophers and voles. So coyotes, foxes, and even like great horned owls regularly hunt the little green patches basically that are alongside of roads, and they can be hit by cars if you're driving fast, especially they don't have time to get out of the way as they swoop down or they jump in or out of those areas. So especially when you're in rural areas or parks, driving slowly gives them a little bit more time to get out of the way. Another thing that is becoming more and more common, and especially here in California, probably many of you have seen the news, is wildlife crossing areas. So it's possible to create an either above the road wildlife crossing or even under the road a culvert that gives a place for animals to cross without the risk of being hit by a car. If there isn't one of those options, it's also really important that whatever fencing might be alongside the road be something that's wildlife friendly so that they can get through the spaces between the wires. So for example, concrete barriers are really dangerous for wildlife because they can get trapped between concrete barriers on both sides, depending on their ability to jump over or get around. And so if there's going to be a barrier, it's best that it has spacing for the wildlife to get through, but ideally an underpass or overpass in places where wildlife regularly crosses the road. And that's frankly better for people too, because people get injured when they hit wildlife. Cars get damaged, but people get hurt too. So avoiding those kinds of collisions is better for everybody. And then the other thing we can all do to help our wild neighbors is be an advocate and help share the information we have. I'm a huge believer in community conversations and talking to neighbors about issues. And if you have a neighbor that has pet food out that's attracting coyotes, having that conversation can really help reduce the possibility of a conflict in your neighborhood. So this is just an example of a wildlife crossing. Obviously, down in LA, the one in honor of P22 is going up, the famous mountain lion. But we have some there's one in Santa Cruz here. There are probably others all around the state, and I know in Utah as well. So they're becoming more and more common as a way to try and avoid the collisions. Sometimes people are worried about what to do if a coyote approaches you. And so I always like to talk a little bit about what you do. Um, Most of the time, a coyote or any other wild animal, especially a predator, shouldn't approach you and won't approach you. They'll be afraid of you, they'll be skittish, they'll hide, they'll walk or run away. They're not going to want to approach you. In all the time I've spent, I've only been approached a handful of times by coyotes, and all of them have been instances where it's a coyote that's been fed. So typically it is a coyote that's habituated to humans. They've been fed. They've been studying some here just north of San Francisco in Rodeo Beach. They've put ear tags on a group of coyotes that were being fed regularly, and they're trying to sort of monitor where they go and their activities. But that does lead to bolder behavior and leads to coyotes approaching people regularly for food if that's a source of food they've come to expect. And the best thing you can do to help those coyotes and help yourself is haze them. And by haze them, that means make yourself a really, really unappealing thing to be near. So you want to make yourself really big, your arms over your head, Superman, Superwoman pose, and then really loud. So you can bang things together, yell, clap your hands, blow a whistle, air horn. Some people put rocks in like a soda can and shake the can. Um, Anything that's going to make a lot of noise, basically to tell the coyote, like, get away. You don't want to be anywhere near me. I'm certainly not feeding you, and I'm scary. And it can help over time if coyotes that have been fed in the past are no longer being fed and are consistently hazed. That can cut down on that behavior where they approach people in the first place. It is also important to note that you really shouldn't run. Most predators have a sort of prey instinct. And so if something is running away from them, the instinct will be to chase it. It's unlikely you would be injured in any significant way, but you don't ever want to trigger a chase by a wild animal. So don't run. And then just really quickly, Project Coyote, we have a website that has a lot of resources about coexistence and about coyotes. As I mentioned, I'm the program chair of the Keeping It Wild Youth Education and Outreach Program, but we also have a ranching with wildlife program that helps people who might have ranches or agricultural areas, things you can do to coexist with native predators and reduce any losses or conflicts, things like guardian animals, fox lights, things like that. We have a coyote friendly communities program that has signs that can be put up around areas that have coyotes, signs that talk about not feeding coyotes, as well as other coexistence tips, and really have a variety of other resources, videos and articles, things to read about coyotes and to help people in the community who might want to learn more and who might want to help others learn as well. So this slide is just some of our tips for coexistence. It's the things that we've already really been talking about, things like not feeding them, to not have things that are attractants, which is like pet food and trash, to make sure you're keeping a close eye on your pets. Ideally, if your cat's inside and your dog's on a leash, if you're in a coyote area, and then to haze coyotes if they get close to you, and to appreciate them at a distance, because that's what will help keep them wild. And then lastly, one of my favorite quotes, because the mission of this organization, and I think many other conservation groups, is that small groups of people can make an enormous difference in a local community. And this is one way that all of you can help coyotes and other wildlife and hopefully appreciate what they bring to the ecosystem. They're a really important part of any healthy ecosystem. So that's that. And now I'm actually ready for questions. So we have a lot of time for questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was awesome. And so if folks have questions, two options. You can either unmute yourself and raise your hand and ask the question, or if you'd like to type the question into the chat, I will be happy to relay the question to Sarah. So I'll get things started. And so I was kind of interested in the hunting behavior like within the pack context. And so if there's a mating pair that has pups in the den, do both of the parents typically go out for the day to hunt? Does one stay with the pup and the other hunts? They take turns? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and canines in general, both parents raise the young. So, like with bobcats, for example, mom's on her own. Mom has got those kittens and she's got to figure out feeding them, and nobody's watching them when she's out hunting. But foxes and coyotes, both adults, both parents, the male and the female, will take care of the young and will hunt and bring back food. So, um, typically, if the pups are really small and nursing, the mother is more likely to be the one at the den and the father is more likely to go hunt. But over time, they will alternate that. And they do generally leave one, not necessarily in the den with the pups. They often, it's sort of fascinating to watch. They'll actually pick a vantage point that's a little bit higher up and maybe a little bit further away that allows them to scan incoming threats before they're actually at the den. Because if they're in the den, if they're in that hole, they don't know that there's a problem until the problem is in the hole there with them. And so they have sort of like a sentry position that they take to watch over the den, but they do both get food. And eventually the pups, even when the pups are supposed to stay in the den, like all unruly children, eventually they want to get out and, they've got their wiggles and they run and they wrestle and they play. And even before they're hunting, they're sort of out of the den, which is another reason that the parent who's watching them ends up being out of the den as well, because they have to keep an eye on all the tumbling little pups around them. And then the pups will start hunting themselves eventually. But mostly it'll be the parents for a number of months.
Great, thanks.
Sure.
All right, Andra.
Yeah. Hi there. First of all, thank you so much for this presentation. I have really enjoyed it. I
Yeah.
work at a wildlife park that exhibits native animals, so I talk with a lot of guests. We are in a semi-rural area that has coyotes. You mentioned alternatives to rodenticide because that can cause a lot of problems.
Mhm.
What are your favorite alternatives besides, maybe keeping our garbage in our homes more secure?
So, in an ideal world, we wouldn't need rodenticides because we wouldn't have sort of the overpopulation of I mean, so the any population size is driven by the availability of its food source, right? So, if there isn't enough food for the rodents, they would die off, right? So that's one piece of it, right? Not providing the trash and the food that keeps it there. And then the other thing that helps regulate those populations is the predators. So things like owls and coyotes and foxes and bobcats, the native predators, also help keep those populations in check. So it's a combination of reducing the food source and ensuring that there's a healthy predator population that really keeps
Mhm.
the ecosystem running.
Yeah, and we had a talk back in the fall on using raptors for mitigating rodents in agricultural settings, and there are some nice suggestions there in terms of different nesting boxes and perches and those sorts of things that you can add to an area to help encourage raptors to come in and help with those rodent issues.
Yeah, I know a barn owl pair will eat 70 pounds of rodents in a year.
Hmm.
So I
Yeah.
know, especially here in the wine country north of the San Francisco Bay Area, barn owl boxes are a big thing in all the vineyards.
Yep. Yep. All right, Jeff.
Yeah, so I know you mentioned that coyotes typically hunt individually. We see coyotes frequently in Briones Regional Park near Berkeley area. And
Mhm.
one time we saw, I think it was probably at least three coyotes chasing a deer across a meadow. It sounds like that's pretty infrequent. How often do they ever catch a deer?
Hmm. It's interesting. So they don't generally hunt deer, although they certainly would take, if they could, especially if it was injured, ill, or very young. What's interesting to me is I've actually not seen coyotes chasing deer, but deer chase coyotes as well. So sometimes the coyotes chase, so um, deer are sort of fascinating. At least I'm talking about black-tailed deer, which I assume is what's in Briones as well. Um, they will approach things like coyotes and bobcats and stomp their feet and actually will chase and run around. And if they can, they will kick and kill pups and kittens. And so sometimes the adults are actually chasing off the deer to protect their young from the deer. So I don't know in what you observed, it's pretty uncommon. But I don't know whether that was sort of a get out of my yard kind of debate, or whether they were chasing it with the interest of I don't, they don't generally hunt in packs. I have seen a group of badgers go, I mean, excuse me, a group of coyotes try and get a badger as well, like engage in a conflict with a badger. I wouldn't say they were trying to hunt it so much as they were trying to get it off its mound as a competition, I think, for the gophers in the field. Um, so I I think it's possible at least that they were just trying to get the deer out of the area as opposed to trying to eat it. But they certainly could and would eat an injured deer if they, if that was available to them.
Well, this was not an injured deer, but now that you're talking about it, I do remember that this meadow was across the trail road from an area where there were pups.
Yeah.
We also saw pups around the same time, so perhaps they were chasing it out of the area.
Yeah, I think that's very
Mhm.
likely then. Yeah,
Thanks.
sure.
Right.
Cool
All right,
sighting.
so we got some questions in the chat. So Matthew asks, what is the lifespan of a coyote typically?
Um, it depends. It's obviously in the wild versus in captivity is different, but generally I'm going to say 7 years, 7 to 10 years max. But I would, probably most wild predators, especially like bobcats and coyotes, it's more like 5 to 7. Again, it depends on the area, the risk of road strikes and rodenticides, and a lot of them don't survive being pups, right? So it, you know, varies.
And so then kind of along those lines, Terry was wondering at what age is a coyote considered an adult?
Hmm. Um, they usually would stay with the parents into their first year and then would be pushed to disperse somewhere between years 1 and 2. And upon dispersal would then generally seek to find a mate and start reproducing. And so I would say that's generally the timeline.
Right. Do you have any sense of the kind of overall, populations of coyotes in California, like what the trends there look like? Are they going up, down, fairly stable?
I don't have a sense of the population of coyotes here in California. My guess is it's probably pretty stable. I, I doubt it's going down, but I don't know for sure.
Okay. Ken is wondering, do you have any sense of the percentages or rate of occurrence for rabies in urban coyotes?
I don't. My sense overall is that rabies is far less common than people think it is, in general. And I think, things like raccoons and bats are a much more likely rabies vector than coyotes, but I don't know a percentage.
Okay. And then AC is wondering, you said coyotes are pretty widespread. Have they made it all the way up to Alaska, or is that too far
Yes.
north for them? They are
Nope,
in
they have.
Alaska. Wow.
Yep. Yep. They're through Canada and yeah, down into Mexico. Yeah, coast to coast.
And you said that that's a relatively recent development, right?
The last couple hundred years, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating. I just sort of assumed they had always been all over the place, but that makes sense with the larger predators being displaced.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that wolf populations tend to keep coyote populations in check. And so the eradication of wolves in a lot of this country certainly created a space for them. But, you know, yeah, the ecosystem concept, right? Every time you add or subtract something, you change everything else in that system. So coyotes are very smart and very adaptable, and they see an opening and find a way to, I mean, if you watch them, you know, what they eat and hunt in one part of this country versus another is different, but they find a way to adapt and to thrive. It's impressive.
Yes, and HC had another question that kind of follows along with that. So, especially in the inner coast range where I spend a lot of time, one of the most common smaller animals I see are the western fence lizards.
Mhm.
Do coyotes go after reptiles at all, or do they mostly focus on small mammals?
Um, they will pretty much eat anything that they can. I mean, even bugs and sort of like old like dried scat or manure. And I mean, they are scavengers in a sense. So I would say it depends more on what's available to them, right? I mean, and if they can easily get a gopher's a good meal if you're a coyote. So if they can get gophers or brush rabbits, they'll probably go for that. If they can't, then they're going to go for whatever they can find.
Of course. Anne asked if you could show the last slide with the easy tips for coexistence again.
I think I can. Let's see. Will it let me do that? There.
Great.
Sure thing.
And then Martha noticed that many of the coyotes in the photos look kind of slender.
Mhm.
Do they just tend to be slender, or is that due to food limitation?
So they do tend to be slender, which I think, when you have to work that hard to eat, it probably precludes getting too heavy generally. But it's also somewhat a function of climate. So here in California, we generally will have smaller, thinner animals, and places like the Northeast where there's snow and it's colder, you end up with thicker animals with heavier body weights as well as thicker coats. The other thing I would say is that some of these images were some relatively young coyotes, which tend to look, I think, particularly slender. And those young coyotes had their summer coats, and summer coats are definitely much thinner looking coats than their big fluffy
Hmm.
winter coats. But some of it is that these are with the exception of one or two that are from Yellowstone, which is still sort of the West, but definitely a little bit more snow there. Most of these images are California coyotes, and California coyotes are going to be a little bit smaller and thinner than some that are in the Midwest or the East Coast.
Let's see here. So you've talked a fair bit about bobcats. Coyote bobcat interactions, do they fight with each other at all? What's the interaction like there, if any?
Yeah. Yeah, I can't help myself. I love the bobcats. They always come up at least a little bit. So bobcats and coyotes do interact because they tend to overlap in the types of territories they're in, and they eat the same food sources, right? So bobcats also are going to eat voles, like the field mice, and gophers and quail, um, as well as other small things that they can catch. And so the interactions generally are the coyotes chasing the bobcats, either chasing them out of the territory or chasing them to try and get them to drop the gopher they just caught. So this last year, in an area that I've been photographing a lot, we had a lot of coyote pups, like 3 different dens that had 7 pups each. And so
Oh,
once they were all mobile, suddenly there were literally, it felt like coyotes everywhere. And the cats all got like super skittish. The bobcats, as soon as normally if they kill a gopher, they just sit down in the field and they eat it, right? And it's amazing how fast they can spend 45 minutes hunting it and consume it in like 90 seconds. It's super fast
Oh,
normally. And when all these coyotes were everywhere, the cats instead would run into the brush with the gopher, and they wouldn't even try and start eating it until they were hidden in the brush. And I think it was in part because they were worried that they were going to get charged by some of these coyotes and have their food stolen. But yeah,
wow.
the coyotes will chase the cats, and cats, when they're afraid, one of the things they will do is climb, right? So people talk about treeing cats. So bobcats will climb fence posts. I've seen them climb telephone poles, as well as trees, but to get away from a threat, which could be another cat or it could be a coyote.
Wow. Martha is asking about coyote wolf hybrids, something that's happened a bit in the eastern US. Is that something we're seeing on the West Coast at all?
No, it's a pretty uncommon thing, and it's more, that there's a little bit of coyote or wolf in the other's DNA and some of the East Coast species. That's not something that certainly not that I'm aware of that's happening out here.
Okay. A couple of folks are wondering about mange in coyotes. Could you talk about that at all?
Yeah. So mange is one of those things that for me is always a heartbreaker to see. It is a mite, and it's transmitted by contact. So if you think of these as animals that live in a pack, and even if they're individually hunting during the day, they're coming together in the evenings, or if there's a larger food source, they might all be eating from that same food source. So there's a lot of physical contact between the members of that pack. So mange can pretty easily be spread to all the relatives in the pack. But it causes them to itch, and they itch so violently that they generally will itch off their fur, and it leads to them having skin that can be cracked and bleeding. Depending on the temperatures in the area, it can lead to hypothermia. It can kill them because they lose their fur. It's really unfortunate. Some animals are able to sort of get rid of it and eliminate it on their own. It is treatable. The ivermectin and Bravecta are things that are given to dogs for different types of parasites. They do work on mange, but um, generally there haven't been programs approved by California Fish and Wildlife to treat wild coyotes. It's a little complicated getting the medicine to a wild coyote and feeding it that in a way that doesn't habituate it, and you don't feed the wrong animal or the wrong species altogether. So
Hmm.
but it is hard as someone who loves wildlife to see them with it, because mange was originally introduced in Yellowstone to try and kill off the wolves. So mange was a human introduced parasite,
Mm.
basically.
Wow.
And now to see coyotes suffering with it, when we know it's treatable, but can be challenging to treat wildlife for sure. It's a heartbreaker for sure. But they're really, other than that, there isn't anything. If an animal is really sick, coyotes are hard for like wildlife rehabbers to get. It has to be pretty sick for a place to bring it in. But if it is, they will, and it is treatable. And so
Hmm.
when animals are particularly ill and emaciated, if they have mange, as part of what happens when they go to a rehab center, they can treat it. But the average somewhat mangy coyote, because some coyotes don't lose their full coat, they just have like bald patches, and their tail will be really scraggly, and I mean they won't look great, but they won't be bald, and so
Hmm.
they might just survive and eventually get rid of it, but it's really sad to see while they have it.
Yeah, wow. And so one other question from the chat, and this is actually something I've been wondering about. So, in Sacramento, I see deer, I see coyotes, and I see huge amounts of turkeys. And so do coyotes hunt turkeys at all?
I mean, there isn't any reason they couldn't. I've never seen it. I am aware, I know of one instance where I know a bobcat hunted a turkey, which is fascinating to me. But again, coyotes are generally not going for birds. I would say they do that less often than the cats do. Like bobcats eat a variety of birds, quail
Mm,
and other things. It's less common than the rodents. So for a coyote to take a turkey, I mean, again, in the context of if no other food is available and there's a flock of turkeys nearby, would they go for a turkey? I'm sure they would, because it's food and that's survival. Um, but I don't know what the odds of success would be on that. Yeah, it's an interesting question.
yeah, I think especially with what you were saying about the average weight of coyotes, which is I think like a lot of folks, I thought they were bigger than they actually are, compared to some of the turkeys that are out there.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, and some of it's probably just all in the method that they take it down, right? I mean, if they get a turkey's neck at the right angle, could they kill it fast?
sure,
Probably. I mean, river otters can kill brown pelicans. So I've got to assume,
right,
a coyote could take a turkey if it wanted to. I don't know if it would be worth the effort if they have a different food source available.
makes sense. Great. All right. Do we have any final questions for Sarah? All right. Well, thank you again for a great talk, and thank you to everyone for coming out. Um, And so these talks are monthly. So our next talk is coming up on the fourth Thursday in May. That's going to be a talk by Andrew Johnston on the history of mercury mining in Northern California, which should be interesting. These talks are all supported by donations from viewers like you. So if you're able to and haven't done so already, we would very much appreciate a small donation to help keep the series running. I put the link in the chat there. And please do check out Tuleyome's website, tuleyome.org, for all of our upcoming events, including these talks, wildflower tours, and lots of other fun things. All right. Well,
Jeff,
with that, I hope everyone else has a lovely rest of your Thursday evening.
thank you so much. And Jeff, if anyone's interested, Project Coyote does have our Project Coyote pack. You can go to our website and sign up to be on our email list. It is, I think, some of the best run email information you could be part of if you care about native predators and protecting them across the country. We are California based, but we run campaigns, including a ban on wildlife killing contests and other campaigns that are nationwide. And our emails are really specific, easy to do tasks that help either contact legislatures or sign petitions or get involved to protect predators, both here in California and across the country. So if this topic has been of interest to you and you love coyotes and other predators, I would encourage you to go to projectcoyote.org and check out joining our pack. And thank you so much, Jeff.
Awesome.
This has been great, really fun.
Of course. Yeah, it's been great having you.